As Europe faces a migration crisis, Germany tightens its border controls. What does that mean for asylum seekers? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. On Monday, Germany re-established checks at all its land border crossings. This after two deadly knife attacks this summer were blamed on migrants. Neighbouring nations are now concerned about the new measures and how they might impact travel inside the European Union. EU rules say member states can temporarily reintroduce controls at internal borders if there is a serious threat, but only as a last resort. CGTN's Peter Oliver has this report.
The new normal. For the next 6 months, German police are carrying out extra checks at the nation's border posts with its neighbours, fellow signatories to the Schengen Free Movement Agreement.
The checks are targeted at vehicles where we suspect illegal immigration. By doing so, we want to keep the inconvenience of commuters and the transfer of goods to a minimum.
There had been a large amount of pressure on Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition to take action on migration after a fatal stabbing back in August. The main suspect has been identified as a failed asylum applicant from Syria. Results in local elections in Saxony and Thuringia, where the far-right anti-migration AfD party picked up major gains, also ramped up calls for Scholz to do something about irregular migration into Germany. However, freedom of movement across borders is a big part of European identity. It is enshrined in the Schengen Agreement, named for the small town in Luxembourg bordering France and Germany, where it was signed in 1985. It allows for the removal of border checks between the vast majority of EU states, as well as Switzerland, Norway and Iceland. Among those living in this area, opinion is pretty much split over Germany's decision to introduce this additional border security.
My opinion is it probably needs to be checked for the time being to ensure that you have an overview and then you can just switch back to the old mode. It's that simple.
We were used to this, we were used to Schengen, we were used to no borders, free traveling around countries. And this, I think, defeats the purpose of the European Union, it defeats the purpose of Schengen, it defeats the purpose of being European citizens.
German authorities must find the balance between protecting national boundaries and keeping commuters and everyday traffic moving. The majority of migration is understood to come through Germany's eastern borders, along routes that have been active since the migration crisis of 2015, when hundreds of thousands of people arrived to claim asylum. However, the latest checks apply to all crossing points with Germany's 9 neighbouring countries. Police say this is essential.
Last week, there was a larger group of Syrian citizens whom we intercepted in a regional train from Strasbourg. There were 15 of them. We notice illegal migration on a daily basis, which shows us that illegal migration is happening, and that our focus is right as far as the German-French border is concerned.
The checks are set to remain in place for the next 6 months, despite criticism from Germany's EU partners, including Poland and Greece, who have accused Berlin of putting freedom of movement, a cornerstone of the European Union bloc, at risk. Peter Oliver, CGTN, Schengen, Luxembourg.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from New York, Dimitrios Soultogiannis is the US correspondent at Star TV Greece. From Paris, we're joined by Joav Toker. He is an associate professor of international relations and diplomacy at the American Graduate School in Paris. Here in Washington, D.C., Edmund Ghareeb is an academic and Middle East expert. And from Geneva, we're joined by Patrick Taran. He is president of Global Migration Policy Associates. Welcome to all of you to the show. Patrick, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. Let me start with you. As we just heard, Germany is now enforcing checks at 9 of its borders to crack down on what it says is irregular migration. What does that mean, irregular migration?
Well, in the US parlance, irregular migration means essentially people who enter a country without inspection or without necessarily having required entry documents. But I think the the term refers to a larger phenomena that with the very restricted immigration and migration channels in many countries, for employers to get the workers they need in a situation of declining or what they call shrinking workforces, a lot of people and a lot of employers are forced to or obliged to look at or surreptitiously say, come, we'll find a way for you to get in because we need the workforce.
Right, and Patrick, one other point about Germany. I mean, if we look at the numbers of people seeking asylum across the European Union, that number has gone down over the past year. But is Germany experiencing something of a surge in people trying to enter the country?
Well, I think if I would step back and look at the bigger picture, that between 2015 and 2030, the German workforce shrinks or declines by about 6 million people. That's simply the fact of low birth rates, aging population, immigration as well, including of German youth, meaning that the people that are needed there, and it's similar in other countries, the people needed there to do the work aren't there. And that the solution for, or the response for Europe and other Western countries as a whole is looking at freer mobility rather than targeting a very small proportion of migration, which is irregular. I mean, you're looking at a country that receives, I think, upwards of 1 million legal immigrants or people who come through the regular channels per year versus a relatively small proportion of people who enter irregularly, and most of those are people fleeing war and situations of economic disaster elsewhere who come basically literally to seek asylum, seek safe haven, seek protection from situations that are unlivable elsewhere. But again, I stress that's a small proportion of movement overall. And again, to give you an overall figure, net migration into European countries has been about 3 million per year for decades. And the last year it's increased. But again, as you just noted, and as your report just noted, the actual number of people seeking asylum and entering, shall we say, without inspection may not be increasing at all, at least at this point.
Right, Dimitrios, great to have you with us as well. I just want to get into those numbers in a bit more detail. I mean, a large number of migrants have crossed the Mediterranean to try and reach Europe. Crossings until the end of August soared by, that's this year until the end of August, soared by 123% in the Western Mediterranean. The total number of migrations is actually down 35%. So what do these numbers tell you?
Look, thank you for having me on the show. First of all, illegal migration is actually happening. Just to give you an example, I was in Greece myself this past summer. I was on the island of Crete, and in front of my own eyes, a boat arrived with 60 people from Libya. We actually did a report on Star about that. In front of my own eyes, 60 people from Libya, a boat arrived on the southwestern part of the island of Crete. It was a long procedure to get them processed. Obviously, these people don't want to stay in Greece. These people want to go to the West. And that's why Greece, as the frontline country right now, and the Greek government is very nervous with that decision by the German country, because by Germany, I'm sorry, because they see that as a unilateral act against the Schengen zone agreement.
Right, you say unilateral act, but there are provisions in the Schengen agreement, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, that allow countries to reimpose border controls, don't they?
Absolutely, you're right about that. But what Greece and the Greek government is nervous about is pushbacks not to the country of origin, but rather to the count of entry. So, you know, as you remember back in 2015, 2016, Greece, and rightly so, is nervous about this because, you know, it was once again in the front lines of the refugee crisis with back then millions of people coming in from Syria. So obviously this is something that the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis is going to bring up, I assume, in the next coming weeks in Brussels to see how we can work as a team in the EU rather than, you know, unilaterally.
Right, Joav, Toker, as Dimitrios points out, there is some alarm among some European nations about the German decision to reimpose these border controls. Some have criticized Germany as well because they say this violates the Schengen Agreement. This is the free travel arrangement among Europeans. In fact, the German Council for Migration called it, quote, a dangerous form of populism. What do you make of it? And what do you make of this accusation that it's a form of populism?
Well, unfortunately for the cohesion and the coherence behavior of the 27 members of the EU, indeed things are unclear, very much so. And they give birth to speculations or assessments regarding populism. If you look at the figures, and you mentioned some of them, although it's very difficult to get an overall idea of how things are getting worse or better, and it also depends through which filter do you make your assessment regarding a better situation or a worse one. Objectively speaking, the figures by themselves, per figures, are not worse in terms of significantly larger numbers of refugees or asylum seekers which are trying either to cross the Mediterranean from the south or try to get access to the European Union from the east. What is getting worse, and this is for sure, and this is not a quantitative element, is actually what you refer to as the tendency to behave in a so-called populist way. I think that many governments, the most prominent one amongst them right now is Germany, is reacting in a harsh way. Some even say in sort of a panic. In Germany, mainly because of the local elections which took place in two of the regions of Germany, the eastern part of the country, which were very favorable to the extreme right and more than the extreme right parties, of which the major element of popularity is indeed the anti-immigration tone and the anti-immigration measures they proposed. But we had similar phenomena in France. Just recently, we had similar phenomena like that in Italy over the last year and a half. We have somehow similar phenomena in Denmark, in Belgium, in Austria. Now, why do all these governments seem to panic right now, more so than, say, 2 years ago or 1 year ago, is a different conversation. Yeah. But right now, it is not that the situation is getting radically different. It is that the political approach of the governors are sort of unclear, and really speaking about which way is it heading towards, nobody really knows.
Okay, well, as you say, some governments are panicking, and they're also looking to place the blame somewhere else. I mean, the EU blames Russia for the current migration wave. The President of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, said Russia is luring migrants from Yemen and then forcing them up towards the Finnish border. I mean, do you believe there's anything to this?
I don't know factually on the terrain whether that has some objective reliability. I know and I remember that there were all kind of awkward exercises carried out by the Belarusian government about 2 years ago, which actually organized a considerable number of refugees which have flown all the way from the Middle East to Belarus, and they just packed them and deposited them next to the Polish border. Poland, obviously, is a member of the EU, and that was a way of exercising pressure on the Polish and the EU authorities, and it was interpreted at the time as possibly a Russian initiative operating through the close ally with Belarus.
Edmund, Ghareeb, a large number of the migrants seeking refuge in Europe come from conflict zones in the Middle East. If we look at Syria, that's been mentioned. We look at the situation in Yemen as well. There are other parts in that region where there are conflicts which are forcing people out. People are heading north. I mean, to what extent is that contributing to what we're seeing in Europe right now?
Clearly, there is a wave of migration that we have Europe has witnessed and Middle Eastern countries have witnessed, as well as others in North Africa over the past decade or a couple of decades. Why did this happen? This happened for a variety of reasons. Of course, there's the economic hardship in some of these countries, human rights violations, repression of minorities, ethnic groups, religious minorities. In addition to that, you find that in some of these countries, it is the conflict and violence. It is also the European and American interference in the internal affairs of a number of countries in the region. We have seen this, for example, in the case of Iraq, where the U.S. and its allies imposed some of the harshest sanctions in human history, or at least in modern history, as far as we know. This has led many Iraqis to flee the country, and it did not affect the regime. We ended up seeing the U.S. and allies interfering and bringing down the regime. The same thing in Syria. We've seen interference in the internal affairs of Syria. We have seen sanctions, harsh sanctions, placed on the Syrian people. There are 2 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon is a country of 4.5 million people. Right. Europeans complain because there are, as you mentioned earlier, there's a small number of refugees coming from the Middle East or from Africa, and it's actually much, much less than it was last year. Right. Instead, we're seeing a great deal of tension. There are some offers of aid, but these do not do the job. Lebanon's facing serious problems, and we're finding also that people in Europe, don't realize that while there are some negative effects, there are positive ones. Right. Lebanon is losing, for example, doctors, nurses are going to France, Belgium, Holland. And these people are trained, they speak very well trained, they speak many languages, and they're coming in, and Lebanon's losing them. Yes.
Patrick, the European Union Statistics Agency, known as Eurostat, says there have been about 1.4 million asylum applications as of 2023, with about another 1 million expected for 2024. There's also been accusations that the EU treats refugees from Ukraine very differently from those coming from the Middle East or from North Africa or West Africa. Why this sort of selective application of migration policy? There have been accusations that it's actually racist.
Well, I would come back to the fundamental challenge that the European Union and all of its member countries face, which is aging populations, declining workforces, increasing need for example, English or French or European language speaking health workers, workers in transportation, workers in industry, and so on. And the particular concern you raise has sometimes been observed that, well, in the need for workers, white Christian European Ukrainians are certainly perceived by many as more, shall we say, compatible with the culture, history, and the political lines of Western European, Central European countries. And I think the term discriminatory would certainly apply in terms of giving much more favorable treatment to, or in fact welcoming and giving quite ease of entry and ease of access to language, to job training, and so on for people fleeing the Ukrainian conflict, in contrast to asylum seekers. But let me just again insist on a degree of perspective and proportionality. Because even if we talk about 1 million asylum seekers, up to 1 million, we're talking about a portion of less than 20% of the total immigration annually at current rates of about 5 million people entering EU member countries as immigrants or for purposes of staying on an annual basis.
Right, and just one of the thing about migrants seeking refuge in Europe, a German government official says there may be a deal with Rwanda, and Rwanda's been mentioned before, to send asylum seekers there while their applications are considered. And you'll remember, of course, that Britain tried that in 2022, but it was ruled unlawful by a court in Britain. Is there anything to this German proposal?
If you're asking me, I'm
Yeah.
not sure where that proposal is beyond floating an attempt to have a political scapegoat solution to let's send them somewhere else.
Right.
When the reality is the British court ruling is based on international law and European law, to which Germany is at least as accountable as Britain was. So while they may float the solution, it's a solution that is in fact entirely contrary to international law that is in effect ratified by Germany as well as others in terms of the Refugee Convention and Protocol that require a non-refoulement and generally urge that people are provided with at least safe haven and processing of their asylum claim once they've landed on the territory of a particular country.
Dimitrios, there have also been allegations that the Greek Coast Guard has caused the deaths of migrants by forcing them from Greek waters into international waters. In fact, the British state broadcaster, the BBC, reported that this has resulted in the deaths of 43 people over the last 3 years. Has this practice stopped? Has there been any kind of investigation? Has anybody been held accountable for it?
Right. Well, the Greek government, for the past couple of years, actually, has been denying that there are any pushbacks to Turkey and that there's any loss of life. So at this point, I would say that the Greek government is not even willing to engage in a conversation in regards to pushbacks. But this is a real problem. This is happening. And that's why, next week we're going to have a meeting between the Greek Prime Minister and President Erdogan of Turkey on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly here in New York. So this is something that will be discussed because the reports are there, as you mentioned, and you're right. And the Greek government keeps denying that there are any pushbacks to Turkey.
Right, Joav, Toker, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he held a meeting with his Italian counterpart, Giorgia Meloni. And according to the British media, Starmer is, quote, unquote, interested in learning about Italy's plan to send asylum seekers to Albania, where their asylum applications will be processed. I mean, isn't this another type of Rwanda plan?
This is the new trend, if I may say so, but it would be a very a limit type use of the term, right? But this is what seems to be capturing the hopes or the imagination of many political leaders in European countries right now. And actually the leader of this trend is the extreme right Italian Prime Minister, Madame Meloni, who was elected less than 2 years ago with a harsh anti-immigration program, which had mildly down when it came to concrete governance, but which had tried several solutions, among them the Albanian solution you mentioned, which is actually based on the principle that the administrative treatment of asylum seekers will not take place on European grounds, on EU grounds. In the Italian-Albanian case, the asylum seekers will be brought to Albania, where they will be staying in relatively good conditions, financed by Italy or by the European Union, and then over a limited period of time, the dossier will be dealt with relatively rapidly, and then if they do get access to their an asylum seeker status, they go to Italy or elsewhere in the EU. If not, they go back to their origin country.
Right. Edmund, it seems that the European Union and some European countries, they want to outsource the solution to what is a crisis in Europe. I mean, the EU recently gave Lebanon €1 billion to support Syrian refugees and other vulnerable groups, I guess, in Lebanon. I mean, will that work? Will that stem the flow of refugees from the Middle East to Europe?
It has limited it, but it won't stem the flow of refugees. The $1 billion, about maybe little over 700 million, euros, will go to help the Syrian refugees. In Lebanon now, there is economic crisis of unprecedented proportion since the First World War. There are people who are going hungry. If it wasn't for immigrants from outside from Lebanon to in different parts of the world who are helping relatives, the situation would be really disastrous.
Yeah.
$200 million of that will go to help the Lebanese military and the police to prevent refugees from going to. So basically, there's sort of a bribe on the one hand, and this is why I'm saying it's this interventions, the wars. For example, Libya was a perfect example of this. While there were a number of African refugees coming into Libya, the Libyan regime under Gaddafi absorbed some of them and prevented some from going to Europe. Yet the Europeans decided to intervene in Europe with the help of the United States, and we know the chaos that has emerged. Today, there were several Africans who died on the coast of Tunisia. So the situation in Lebanon, in Syria, and there are many refugees coming from Iraq, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from from India, some of them, Pakistan, and trying to reach the West. They want a better life or safety and security. But at the same time, I think there is a responsibility on the part of the Europeans that has to be recognized. And at the same time, not only because of the sending weapons, and which far outweighs the $1 billion that's going to be spent over the next 3 years, yet in addition to that, what we are seeing also is that many of these refugees contribute to productivity, they contribute to public finances, they basically do jobs that Europeans don't want to do. But I recognize that there are challenges of integration, some of it religious, some of it has to do with race, and that's it.
Okay. Patrick, very quickly, I've got less than 30 seconds. You know, the Spanish Prime Minister has injected a bit of realism into this debate. He says, look, migration is inevitable and even desirable, but it has to be managed in some kind of secure way. Does he have a point?
Yes, he has a point, and I think I would emphasize that it's not just a question of desirable, it's a question of absolute necessity for Europe's economic survival. If you're losing 500,000 people in the European workforce every year, and not replacing them, and not replacing a declining population through immigration, I think the problems are only going to get more serious.
Okay. Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.